welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on the other side of what has now been dubbed the climate election, where at last climate action was put first at ballot boxes all over the country. As we begin today, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today and to First Nation peoples all around the world, including our Pacific neighbours. My name is Jane Gardner. I'm the Director of Communications at the Climate Council, and it's my pleasure to facilitate this event today. 18 days ago, we witnessed an Australian federal election like no other. We saw a Green slide in Queensland, the Teals defied their many right-wing critics to defeat long-standing members of the Liberal Party, and for us it was one of those where were you when it happened moments. I was with my Climate Council colleagues in the war room, and we were watching it live, as so many of you would have been as well. And a few hours in, there was a real penny drop moment for us when it became clear that this was the climate election that we'd all been waiting for so long. Voters took their frustration and fury to the polls after a decade of stalling and inaction on climate action, and they sent a very clear message: we've had enough. It's only June, but it's been a big year for climate, and I know everyone joining us today has been on that ride with us here at the Climate Council. So now we've witnessed a significant changing of the Federal Guard, it seems appropriate to ask the question, now what? Today we're lucky to have some brilliant speakers with us to help answer that question, and they're going to take a deep dive into the federal election outcome and what it means for our work at the Climate Council in the years ahead. So joining us today is one of Australia's best known public commentators on the climate crisis in Australia, and our very own CEO Amanda McKenzie, who is at the tail end of recovering from COVID, so bear with her. I hope her voice holds up today. We also have on our panel a highly experienced economist and climate counsellor, Nicki Hutley, and we have climate council researcher Dr. Wesley Morgan, who holds a PhD in international relations. So many of you submitted questions ahead of time, thank you. We'll do our best to answer as many as possible. If you'd like to submit a question, it's not too late. Please just type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, where our researcher, Dr. Carl Titterman, or the other Dr. Carl as we like to call him, who is here behind the scenes today, will get to as many as he can. So let's get into it. The first question is for Amanda. Amanda, as I've mentioned, this election finally became the climate election we've all been waiting for. As someone who's been at the forefront of this fight for many years, can you tell us about the work that went into creating this shift and what you think changed this time around?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think this time, this climate election has been in the making for probably well over a decade. I think that I remember very vividly the sort of period of prior to Abbott being elected, sort of 2011, 2012, when there was a La Nina, it was raining, and there was a lot of justification from conservative commentators of it's raining, therefore climate isn't happening. And Tony Abbott came into power in 2013. That sort of period was the lowest ebb of public opinion on climate change, in terms of people's concern being relatively low. People weren't making the link between extreme weather and climate change. People really thought that this was an external issue. This was about polar bears and ice caps very far away into the future. So there was a huge amount of work that's been done to change the public narrative and public perception of the issue, put it at top of people's minds when there is an extreme weather event like the terrible floods, like the bushfires, to contextualise those events as being climate related, and also to bring a broad range of commentators from our fire chiefs to doctors to solar installers, a whole raft of different people that could make the issue much more tangible and relevant for people, whether it was the extreme weather events occurring and contextualising those, or whether it was making the solutions real to people. In making the solutions real, it's also been a lot of work at the state level, at a local government level, at business level, getting solutions happening and then profiling them, making the solutions seem real and tangible, and people having direct experience of those solutions. So there's been a lot of work by lots of different people across climate-driven not-for-profits, but also in sustainability officers in councils or politicians within state governments. There's a huge range of different people that have been working on this. to create the change and create the level of push and drive for change that was really seen during this election. So I think that was enormously positive. And we've also got some election analysis that I'll pop into the chat as well that might be useful for people to sort of delve into this more deeply. But I think there's been a role for everyone that's cared about this issue and has been pushing it, whether it's writing letters to the paper, whether it's supporting organisations, a huge range of things. So, everyone needs a pat on the back before, getting well into the work of, well, now we've got to get the outcomes from this new parliament.
Yeah, it's certainly been incredible to witness. And I think people might have been surprised by just how many Australians have come out in strong support of climate action. So, Amanda, what kind of message does this send to the new Albanese government? What do we need to see from them now?
Yeah, well, I was really pleased to see them publicly acknowledge multiple times that this was the climate election. There's always a concern that, that sort of thing is going to be downplayed. So I think, number one, they've acknowledged it. I think we did a lot of work in the last couple of weeks to try and really push that narrative. Yes, this is a climate change election, not just from those teal independents in the inner cities, but it was also a whole range of independent races, whether it was around the Northern Rivers region, whether it was in Gilmore on the south coast of New South Wales, that was heavily affected by bushfires. Lots of different parts of Australia that were regional as well as in the cities had climate change as one of the really prominent issues. So been pleased to see that both the journalists commentating on the election as well as the Labor Party have acknowledged that. So our work going forward is to reinforce that message about what needs to happen and how large the scale of action is that's required this decade. We often talk about the lion's share of action having to happen this decade. So that's, of course, getting pollution down. We'd love to see Australia turn from being an absolute laggard on climate globally to being a climate leader. And we've put forward a whole range of policy ideas to do that. We also think that we need to be much better prepared for worsening extreme weather events. We're also buoyed that, as you know, one of the projects of the Climate Council is emergency leaders for climate action. So that's Greg Mullins and a range of former fire chiefs. We were really pleased that the first meeting that the government took was on climate was with the emergency chiefs, with the Emergency Services Minister, as well as with Chris Bowen and Jenny McAllister, the two ministers responsible for climate action. I thought that was a really good sign and sort of bookended the period when Abbott had come in. The first act of the government was to abolish the Climate Commission and then subsequently get rid of a whole range of different things that were working to get emissions down. And then this period, it started with that really positive meeting with the emergency leaders. So I'm certainly not under any illusions that a Labor government will get everything done. I think that one of the pieces of the puzzle is for us to socialise is a word I like to use, socialise, get the public excited about a bunch of the solutions around energy policies, around stopping fossil fuel expansion, etc., that gives Labor the push to get a bunch of these things over the line. And, hopefully the teal independents are doing that work within the parliament as well. And the Greens obviously got a very significant result as well. So they've got an important role to play too.
Thanks, Amanda. And it appears the message is getting through, but we do need to make up for a lot of lost time. So our new government has been doing a lot of work to build our international standing with our allies and has made the promise of action on climate central to their first few weeks in power. In fact, Prime Minister Albanese, as his very first active PM, took off to the Quad meeting in Tokyo, where he declared that Australia was back and his government would make climate action a top priority. This week, we saw a pretty interesting photo op with Mr Albanese riding a bike alongside Indonesia's president while discussing how the two countries can collaborate on climate action. So my question now is for Wes. Wes, over the last 10 years, Australia has fallen behind our key allies and trading partners like the US, the UK and Japan when it comes to tackling climate change. Can you explain in more detail the international context the Albanese government has stepped into and how important it is for us to reset our climate record on the world stage?
Yeah, sure. We have seen a climate election in Australia and the wheel has finally started to turn here in Australia, but it does so in a global context in which we are seeing countries around the world make stronger pledges. And globally, we are now on an inevitable transition to a net zero emissions global economy. And that's important to understand. You know, a key moment was the 2015, to step back a bit, a key moment was the 2015 Paris Agreement, which was a breakthrough agreement in that all countries have signed up to it. And through that framework at the United Nations, they make pledges every 5 years, stronger pledges to cut emissions. And last year in Glasgow, we had, we saw that a vote of confidence in the Paris Agreement when almost the whole developed world set new targets to be cutting emissions this decade. So our key partners and allies like the United States, like the European Union, like the UK, like Japan, like Canada, like New Zealand, they all said that they're going to cut their emissions in half this decade. Australia did not. So we didn't take a new target to Glasgow. And this really saw our reputation as a laggard on climate was really cemented. And, you know, the UN Secretary General earlier this year has described Australia as a holdout on climate action. And I think that's accurate. And that's the way that we're seen internationally. So this election, you know, with new climate ambition from this new government, it brings us closer to the international consensus for what developed countries should be doing to cooperate with other nations through the United Nations and under the Paris Agreement. This is the first of many steps that we will need to take to repair Australia's international reputation with regards to climate change. But I think, you know, just in the first 2 weeks of the new government, Albanese, as you said, went straight to Tokyo, where he met with the US President Biden, met with the leaders from Japan and India. And he made it really clear that he sees climate change as a matter of national security and climate change, or climate action rather, as a matter of foreign policy. And just in the last 2 weeks, we've seen the dividends that Australia reaps from taking real action on climate change. You know, Albanese had congratulatory phone calls from the British Prime Minister. He sat, you know, he renewed the alliance with the US President Biden and committed to working with the US on climate action. But, you know, with the European Union, we've been negotiating a free trade agreement with Europe for some time now. And the European ambassador to the Indo-Pacific has said Australia's new climate commitments, they will unlock this FTA. So, and closer to home with regards to Pacific Island countries, Foreign Minister Wong has said that, you know, climate action will now be at the heart of our relations with Pacific countries as well. So we've been able to reset our relations with the Pacific. So it's clear that climate action is a strategic opportunity for the new government, and we're reaping dividends from that already.
Thanks, Wes. So on that, new Foreign Minister Penny Wong has been touring the Pacific Islands ahead of the Pacific Islands Forum in July. So, Wes, how important will this meeting be for repairing relationships with our Pacific neighbours, and what key climate outcomes are you hoping to see at the forum?
It will be very important. You know, people might remember the last in-person Pacific Islands Forum meeting was in Tuvalu in 2019. And people might remember that then Prime Minister Morrison, he ended up having something of a stoush with Pacific Island leaders at that meeting because he tried to block language on cutting emissions and moving away from coal at that meeting. And after that meeting, we saw people like the Fiji Prime Minister say, look, we're better off having relationships with countries like China. You know, they're better than Morrison is. So it was a real blow for Australian strategy in the Pacific. And the reality is that in a warming world, climate policy is foreign policy. And I think this new government, they understand that. So they have already indicated that they will be, you know, that Foreign Minister Penny Wong, she's already been to Fiji, to Samoa, to Tonga, where she's been telling Pacific leaders that Australia wants to work with them to drive global ambition on climate change. And so the Australian government wants to actually co-host a UN climate summit with Pacific Island nations. And I expect that that will be a proposal that Prime Minister Albanese will be discussing with prime ministers and presidents from around the Pacific at the Pacific Islands Forum next month. Look, Pacific countries, they've been crystal clear on this for decades, really, that for them, climate change is the single greatest security threat that they face. They've been lobbying at the United Nations Security Council. They want the world to understand that climate change is their key security threat. And Australia has developed a renewed interest in the Pacific in the context of geostrategic competition. You know, China has a growing presence in the region, and Australia wants to cement its place as a security partner of choice for the Pacific. But we won't be the security partner of choice unless we're taking action on what they describe as their key security issue. So the Pacific Islands Forum will be key for resetting those relationships, for putting forward this idea that Australia and the Pacific can work together, that they can co-host a global UN climate summit in a couple of years' time. And I expect that will be the key outcomes from the Pacific Islands Forum.
Thanks, Wes. And the word on the street is that you'll be heading to the Pacific Islands Forum in just over a month. So we're really glad to have you there representing the Climate Council.
I'm looking forward to it.
Nicki, I'll go to you now. We've heard how important it is internationally for Australia to act swiftly on climate change, but what about domestically? We're struggling with rising energy prices, inflation, yet another interest rate rise announced just yesterday, and the need to support communities as they transition away from fossil fuels. So can you walk us through the key climate policies Labor has announced and what economic opportunities we stand to gain by embracing climate action?
Thank you, Jane, and good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Camaragal country in New South Wales. Look, you know, I've seen a few comments. I'm watching them as they come through, and a few people a bit dispirited about what the major parties, you know, do they or do they not have a difference? And you know, looking at the so-called teal independents who have been pushing for much stronger targets, more aligned with the Climate Council's objectives of 75% reduction by 2030. But the fact is that, you know, Labor is at least pushing us a step further, and they are committed to climate action. They embrace the narrative that climate action is better for the economy as well as the environment and society. And that's a really big change for us. You know, we no longer at the Climate Council, you know, feel scared to express our views in public anymore for fear of, you know, having some government officials sort of, you know, snark at you from the Twitter sphere or similar. There really is believe a significant difference. There's a very clear policy that was put out last year by Labor, which involves, you know, $76 billion worth of new investment that's spread across. Obviously, the energy sector is really important, increasing the renewables mix to 50% by 2030. Now, we know that the states and territories basically want to do that, or the ACT's already kind of got there on their energy grid, electricity grid. But, you know, the government has been holding a lot of new investment back because of the policy uncertainty. So that is going to change. We're going to see a lot more of that. I know the New South Wales government, you know, Matt Keane, the Treasurer and Energy Minister, and his team are very excited about having a federal government that means that they're all rowing in the same direction, not one arm tied behind their back. But of course, all of these things take time, they take capital, and they take skills of Labor. So, you know, one of Labor's policies, again, is a energy transition skills initiative to make sure we have 10,000 places available so that we get the people that we need, because this is a global issue. People are chasing skills for the transition to renewables. So we need more of that, and it's good to see that in place. There's a national EV strategy. I'd like to see something more on emissions standards added to that, but emissions testing at least and reporting will be more transparent. And that's going to make a big difference to how, at the moment, international companies don't even want to really export models, which is why there's so few in the market, and those that are high-end models. But we're already seeing some changes. We're expecting more to come from a range of markets, including China next year. And that'll really help bring down the cost to make it easier for people to access that. There's $3 billion in green metals, hydrogen, towards promoting those industries so that we get, you know, those hard to abate sectors. I think there was a question about that as well. You know, how we make sure that those are being addressed, because, you know, let's face it, if this were easy, it would have been done. There would be no contest about it. So money has to be invested, skills have to be invested in and created, and we have to have the policy framework. But I think we do have a good policy framework. 85 solar banks, 400 community batteries. You know, these are big things that the government has promised, and a big shift from where we were. We can't do it all overnight, but at least there is a plan going forward. And I'm confident, well, at least hopeful, that once we start on this journey, once people see the benefits of this action, that we'll get increasing momentum, and that hopefully we will get closer to the targets that we'd really like to see, to get that faster emissions profile than we've you know, currently got on the agenda. But it is still nevertheless a big shift. And with any luck, the independents, the Greens will push even harder, and you know, perhaps we'll get there a bit faster. But at least it is definitely a step in the right direction. You can see there's a wide range of policy initiatives that will be enacted.
Thanks, Nicki. It's all encouraging, but it's clear that Australia is a long way from the scale and pace of action required. Amanda, I actually have a two-parter question for you, because we're picking up in the chat a few questions around the ALP's emissions target. So we'll start with that. What do you think about the target? Is it inadequate? Can it be scaled up? And then secondly, we'll discuss the Climate Council's new strategic opportunities going forward.
Thanks, Jane. My little daughter's in the background. You might hear a little bit of singing. She's home from kinder today. So the Labor target, 43% reduction by 2030, as you probably guess, we think that that's far too low. Our analysis by scientists like Will Steffen says we need a 75% reduction this decade. And certainly that means that this term of government, we've got to get a whole range of things in place to allow us to rapidly reduce emissions through the rest of the decade. Labor's come with that as an election commitment. So I think that is hard to get them to move on quickly. But I think what we need to do is show that climate action builds political capital. I think the ALP experience federally in the past has been, when they've done things on climate, they've been hit in the media, particularly by the Murdoch press. There's been scare campaigns run against them, and it's cost them politically. So I think our job is to think about how action on climate can be profiled really positively. Matt Keane has had a great experience, I think, and same with others in the New South Wales government, of taking climate action and it being politically beneficial. So how do we, and the energy crisis may provide us with some of this opportunity to say, you know, fossil fuels are highly costly, they're uncertain, there's a whole lot of security dimensions that we need to think of. And if we had invested in renewables, we'd be in a far better position. So the energy, but there's obviously, as someone said in the chat, there's big risks within doing that as well, that the gas companies are obviously arguing for themselves within that context. So I think what we should push Labor to do is to do a whole bunch of different actions on climate, make sure that those actions are profiled positively, and that there is a review mechanism for the target, so that they, to use the coalition's term, are quickly able to be on track to meeting and beating those targets, and then they can be ratcheted up over time. But I think if they have a negative political experience, they're going to be very reluctant to do that. So we've got to be on the side of pushing them as hard as possible to go harder, but within the context of action as being the sort of first point, rather than targets being the first point.
And in terms of strategic opportunities that the Climate Council's planning and how we might actually push the avenues of government into making those meaningful climate commitments, what's the plan for the Climate Council going forward?
Yeah, we are still doing some work on evaluating the landscape and where are going to be the best opportunities, but there are a number of places where we think that there are already great opportunities. So energy efficiency is a great area, particularly as people are feeling energy prices. It's a cold winter. We've been doing quite a bit in that space as well, on the energy, the National Construction Code, for instance, about how you build buildings that are better. I was meeting yesterday with the peak body that does social housing. So they manage 300,000 properties, and talking to them about how they can do, Matilda, come on. They can do 7-star buildings in all of their new builds for 30,000 homes that they've got on their books to build. And then transport, vehicle emission standards are going to be a big fight, and we want to be involved in that, making the case for why we need better vehicle emission standards. So those are two areas that I think are no-brainers for us to be involved with, but there's others as well. And getting I mentioned the mechanism of government. So how do we get the ratcheting of targets and the Climate Authority over time to be recommending better things? That's something that we'll be focused on too.
Thanks, Amanda. It's nice to see little Matilda in the background there. If anyone has any questions for Matilda, just pop them in the chat. Back to you, Wes. So looking ahead for the rest of this year, one of the most important moments on the climate calendar, of course, is the UN's climate conference COP27 in November. So look, given how much of, well, let's face it, a total embarrassment Australia's attendance was last year, where we rocked up with a Santos branded pavilion, all eyes are going to be on the Albanese government and what they show up to this party with. So what does Australia need to take to COP27 in 6 months' time?
Well, right now, actually, because each year they have the big UN climate summit towards the end of the year, November, December. But right now they have what's called the intersessional negotiations, which are happening in Bonn, in Germany right now. And the Australian ambassador for the environment, our lead climate negotiator, has already told the rest of the world formally through this negotiations in Bonn that Australia will be bringing a new 2030 target to the table at COP27. And everyone here knows that target is to, we will be looking to cut emissions by 43% this decade. And so that brings us closer to other developed countries. It brings us closer to the international consensus. It gets us back in the game, but we're still behind, right? And so what Australia will ought to be bringing is deeper emissions cuts this decade. And the 43% should be thought of as the floor for Australia's climate ambition. And you know, the ambassador for the environment also said that Australia will be legislating a net zero by 2050 target. So, you know, these are things that will be formally in Australia's nationally determined contributions that will be taken to COP27. COP27 is also going to have a strong focus on climate finance. You know, around the world, we're not going to tackle climate change if developing countries continue to rely on fossil fuels for their energy needs. For, you know, major economies like India, China, Indonesia, we need to see developing countries moving away from coal. And we also need to be helping the world's vulnerable nations to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So there's an expectation that wealthy countries will bring climate finance to the table. And this is a regular thing in the UN climate talks, but we're at a bit of a key moment now where there's real pressure on the wealthy nations to put forward a new package for climate finance for developing countries. So there'll be pressure on Australia to do that and to rejoin the Green Climate Fund. You know, for reasons unknown, Australia, well, Scott Morrison was on a radio show with Alan Jones when he arbitrarily decided to withdraw Australia from the Green Climate Fund, which was a bit of an own goal because we were providing finance to help developing countries in our region deal with the climate crisis, and that was helping with Australian diplomacy in the region. So we need to get back in the game. We need to rejoin the Green Climate Fund. And we also need to be thinking about what we will contribute. As I said earlier, Australia wants to co-host a UN climate summit, potentially as soon as in 2 years' time. That would be a big deal. We haven't hosted a COP before. So if you can imagine hosting COP in Sydney, we're talking 20,000 international negotiators. A lot of people come, the world's eyes are on us. But Australia will need to get its skates on and planning for that now. So at COP27, they'll need to be putting in the legwork to get support from the rest of the community, the international community rather, for Australia hosting a UN climate summit in 2 years' time.
Thanks, Wes. And as Amanda touched on, another key focus area for the Climate Council is our gas campaign and moving Australia towards a clean energy alternatives. So the next question is for Nicki. Cost of living is such a huge issue throughout the election campaign, and now that Australia's on the brink of this energy crisis, the conversation around our energy future is heating up. So how critical is it for Australia to move away from gas, and what kind of impact is this going to have on our cost of living?
Yeah, this energy crisis that we're seeing now is quite problematic. And of course, we've got people coming into the commentary saying, well, we need more gas more quickly and that'll solve the problem. And of course, that's actually not what we need. It's only going to make things worse. I mean, we were talking earlier about $11 iceberg lettuces and the impact of climate change on the flooding, particularly, but other things as well on fruit and vegetable prices, going up tremendously. I don't know if people are young enough on this Zoom call to remember the great banana crisis after Cyclone Yazzie, but you can see that climate change itself and these unnatural events cause terrible problems in terms of food security and food prices. So we need to think, not just about what the upfront costs are of investing in switching from gas, but also the benefits to individual households, but also to the broader economy. But we know, for example, Victorian government modelling suggested that if households were to switch from their current mix, and they use a lot of gas, to fully electricity, that they'd save somewhere between sort of $360 and $800 a year. We know, gas connections in new homes cost well over $1,000. This is money that you don't have to pay as part of the electricity to be connected to the grid in the same way that the costs are much lower. So we know that if you build houses that are more energy efficient in the first place, so they use less energy, and then you connect them so that they are 100% electrified. We've heard calls from people like Alan Finkel, the chief scientist, not just Saul Griffith in his book, of course, switched on, that we all need to do, if we can electrify and get onto renewables, it not only saves us in emissions, and so all those terrible economic costs, lost economic growth, health costs, inflationary costs, all of these billions and trillions of dollars worth of costs, but it actually saves individual households. And we've just got a report out in the last few weeks on what we need to do around the National Construction Code and lifting to 7 stars, and how much money that houses can save with payback periods of for the upfront investment will pay back within about 5 years for most homes. So we actually benefit from these changes. And when we see the uncertainty, all the geopolitical uncertainty, as well as the terrible price costs of what's going on in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, it just actually puts greater pressure on us to do more to move towards self-reliance and renewables. And of course, that's got to be backed by firming technology with batteries. And that's part of what the ALP is committing to, which is great to see. But, this is not a problem that's going to go away. And certainly investing in more gas is not the answer. That is just exacerbating the problem. Moving to renewables is the only sensible answer here to improve our security and to overall lower our costs over the future. And in fact, I was listening to New South Wales Treasurer Matt Keane talk about the opportunities for manufacturing, which Australia's not been cost competitive in for so many years, a lot to do with the labour costs. But the fact that if we can get our renewable energy down and hydrogen down at really cheap levels, we're actually creating all these new industries or old industries that will be new again, to really bolster our economy, hundreds of thousands of jobs. So, not acting is just disastrous in every possible way you look at it. Acting gives us immense benefits right across environment, society, economy. It's an absolute no-brainer.
Thanks, Nicki, and we'll all be watching very carefully this afternoon for the outcome of this ministers' meeting in Canberra, and hopefully they'll make some wise decisions. Amanda, just before we get to some questions from our audience, we have to acknowledge how central our climate council community has been to achieving this election result and setting the agenda for the incoming government. I mean, obviously all across the country, Australians have demonstrated a huge appetite for climate action, and the Parliament now has a strong mandate to act. So how crucial is it to continue building on this wave of momentum, and what can people do, perhaps the people joining us today on this call, to ensure that the pressure for climate action in Australia stays strong? Oh, you're on mute, Amanda.
Excuse me, sorry, I had an issue with a tower falling down in my background. The perils of working from home with a kid that's sick. So I think it's a really important question, and the importance of community was absolutely critical. We saw that in a number of different ways. Firstly, in terms of over time shifting the narrative and making this something that the community at large understood, got, and was willing to push. I think that the Teal independents, I've had a number of them. One in particular said to Greg Mullins, I wouldn't have done this unless I had been inspired by seeing you out in the media talking about why this is so important. We've provided a bunch of fact-based information to them, for instance. Same with within the coalition or in the Labor Party, some of those members that have been really pushing hard on this, we've been doing background briefings and information for those people as well. So I think the community, we can't underestimate how much people have made this result happen. And I really take people's points in the chat that, certainly this a change of government doesn't guarantee that we will get the solutions that are required. We absolutely have to hold the government's feet to the fire, the whole parliament's feet to the fire on this, and be pushing really strongly for change. And as you know, and as come through in the chat as well, it couldn't be more urgent than today. And I think it's really critical that we don't assume that the incoming parliament will sort the issues out. They're just there. This is when the really hard work begins. I remember being in climate advocacy positions during previous Labor governments, and the amount of pressure that they were under from fossil fuel companies and interests. There will be lots of climate fights in the next few years. There will be scare campaigns. Peter Dutton, in the way that he's structuring his cabinet, he is structuring it, envisaging that there will be fights on energy where he will run scare campaigns. So I'm very cognizant that this is, we're at the bottom of another mountain where we need to work together. We need to be really smart. We need to grow the capacity of the Climate Council now to exist in quite a different environment than we've always been in, a hostile political federal environment. And now we're going to be in an environment where we have more access, there is interest, but that we need to be really powerful and pushing for change. We need to have the solutions. We need to have the solutions, not just from a policy perspective, but the full political analysis and communications analysis about how not only do we get those policies in, but we create public support and desire for those solutions as well. So it's actually quite, I think the complexity of the issue is only increased as we work with a government that is more positive around acting on climate change. So I've got all of those sort of thoughts buzzing through my mind at the moment as we seek to sort of make sure the Climate Council is as fit for purpose as we can be for the next few years.
Thanks, Amanda. And of course, we're going to continue to see very large disasters and escalation and less time between those disasters as well. So it's not like the climate crisis has gone anywhere. It's definitely a large task ahead of us. We're going to broach some questions from our audience now. So first up, we have a question for Wes. And this question's from Helen. What impact will the newly approved Scarborough gas project have on us reaching our emission reduction targets?
It's an excellent question. The way that the global governance around climate change works is our national targets to reduce emissions are our emissions at home. And the short answer is that it won't impact our domestic emissions target, because that gas, almost all of it, will be exported. And this is a major issue for Australia because, we are the world's third largest fossil fuel exporter after Russia and Saudi Arabia. We are close to the world's largest exporter of coal and gas. And our emissions in our exported fossil fuels are roughly double Australia's domestic emissions. So obviously, if we're going to be cutting emissions at home, but we're continuing to expand our exports of fossil fuels, we're not going to be dealing adequately with the problem. So it is carbon bombs is how they describe projects like the Scarborough gas project, and it alone will have emissions that are around 3 times Australia's annual domestic emissions. So we can't be having these new projects if we are to be tackling climate change. And that's a real challenge for the Labor government. One thing that I think I take heart from is that our export markets for fossil fuels are going to want less and less Australian coal. They're going to want less and less Australian gas. They are themselves making commitments to cut their domestic emissions. Over the last 2 years alone, we've seen more than 100 countries worldwide commit to achieving net zero emissions, including our key export destinations, countries like Japan, like Korea, even countries like China. And that is going to quite quickly change our economic interests. So Australia is a major exporter of energy to Asia, coal and gas. In future, they're not going to want our coal and gas, but we will continue to be a major exporter to growing economies in Asia as they transition towards net zero emissions economy. We're just going to be exporting different things. We're going to be exporting the critical minerals that they need for wind turbines, for batteries, for electric vehicles, for the economy of tomorrow. And we're going to be exporting renewable energy directly, and we're going to be exporting clean energy products. And combined, that could be worth 3 times our current fossil fuel exports. So I'm heartened that Albanese in his victory speech said that he wants to see Australia become a renewables superpower. So the Scarborough gas project is hopefully one of the last dinosaurs of the old Australian economy as we shift to becoming a renewable superpower.
Let's hope so, Wes. The next question I have is for Nicki. A question from Rebecca, a really great question. What skills do you think are in short supply but needed to progress climate change prevention and action?
So when you think about the billions of dollars that are going into, excuse me, the renewables sector, the ALPs policy talks about an extra 600,000 jobs across the green economy as we transition. That's a lot of new workers in all sorts of areas, but very specifically, certainly the New South Wales government already, who's much further progressed on renewable energy zones, for example, is talking about shortages in engineers, in electricians, in other special technical workers, but also just in general in all sorts of standard types of skills. Now, research we did last year looked at the types of skills that we currently have in the fossil fuel sector, and roughly 75% of people working already have skills that are directly translatable across into renewables, which is really encouraging. Most of those with maybe a short-term course or a little bit of on-the-job training. So that is both good in terms of people that are going to be available for the new industry, but also in terms of a just transition and making sure that there is appropriate work that's not about mowing fields, as somebody said, underneath the solar panels. This is about actual well-paid technical work that is available. That's part of why the ALP has got this 10,000 places. I think that similar has just been announced by the New South Wales government. In fact, they've got multiples of that in terms of free places available for technical skills at TAFEs to try and support the transition. So we've basically just got to get the message out there to kids that the TAFE qualifications are a good thing to do and a good career opportunity. It doesn't have to be all about universities, and that there will be many skilled job opportunities going forward if we get people training in those right places. But these things do take time. I just want to leave everybody with all the comments that I'm reading. There's a great Bill Gates quote. I know he's not, we don't like to quote him too much, but he says, we always overestimate the change we'll see in 2 years and underestimate what we will see in 10 years. And I think it is just so appropriate for what we're going through. Nothing is happening fast enough when we look at what this week or next month brings us. But we can see the momentum sweeping through. And in 10 years, I think our country and the world will look vastly different. I have to stay optimistic about that.
Thanks, Nicki. My next question is for Amanda. We've had this one a few times, actually. So what is the Climate Council's relationship with the federal government now? Will it be adopted as an advisory body like the Climate Commission was originally set up to be?
Yeah, you would recall that the Climate Commission was established under the Gillard government, and the primary remit of that organisation was to provide information to the Australian public on climate from a range of experts, particularly scientists. When the Climate Commission was abolished, we created the Climate Council. Since that time, we are a much larger organisation than we were under government. We're a lot more flexible, particularly being able to do the communications work we do. And there is, although we were an independent body of government, there still is constraints within working in a government framework. And we have a much broader set of remits that we can work on. So we do information provision, which we did under the Climate Commission. We do a lot of communications work, so translating all of that complexity to the Australian audience, as well as helping to train a whole range of other communicators through our Climate Media Centre. So that's firefighters, doctors, solar installers. You would see lots of the smaller climate organisations, like the Farmers for Climate Action, for instance. They get great media. The Climate Media Centre does it. That's one of the big collaborative pieces that we do, is resource huge numbers of other communicators, roughly 20,000 articles a year. So that work would be very hard to do within government. And then we've got the policy work we do and policy advocacy. I think we're much more powerful staying outside of government. That is a conversation I've had previously, and we've said, no, we don't want to have money coming from the federal government. I think it would limit us, and it also might create a perception that we're not independent. That said, I think that there should be more money going into independent bodies that the government already has, like the Climate Authority needs a total revamp, lots more money to help it do the assessments that it was originally designed to do, like what should our targets be, and to be at arm's length from government. The CEFC, the big green bank arena, there's some great institutions that have survived the last 10 years that can be refreshed. So we're excited about that as well. And we think we can be pushing from the outside in a much more powerful way. But I did say in the comments, I think the thing that's really on my mind is, how do we make sure that we continue to be fit for purpose to do more? I don't think there's anything in our current work that I would necessarily take away. We've done a lot of work advocating to state governments and local governments in the last 9 years. And I think that has created an enormous degree of momentum for change, but also really tangible action that's now can be pointed to, and a federal government can scale. So I think it's important that there are examples of projects that, oh, that's worked. The community's engaged with it in a really positive way, and that can be scaled into the future. So I don't want to pull back on any of the state work and just pivot to federal work. I want to build out more of a federal capacity to be doing that engagement and policy development. So I think my objective is to continue to grow the Climate Council to be able to do that. So pending us getting greater capacity, I think we will be doing more of that advocacy work into the future.
Thanks, Amanda, and it's certainly very exciting to be a part of the Climate Council as this work continues. I have a question from Beck for Wes. This is a really interesting one. Has there been any serious discussion about not repeating the same mining issues of the past associated with setting up renewable at scale to generate for hydrogen production? For example, land clearance, Indigenous land rights, our future stranded assets.
So it is. Has there been serious discussion? There needs to be serious discussion. What we want to do, Australia has this, we're good at digging stuff up, right? We're something of a quarry for the rest of the world, but we're not that good at keeping the wealth from our mining industries in Australia. We're not that good at creating jobs at home. We're not that good at ensuring that benefits flow to Indigenous landowners. We're not that good at ensuring that, mine sites are rehabilitated. So that we need to avoid the pitfalls of and the failures of the mining boom. So as we think about this transition as a country towards being a renewable superpower, we are going to need to have a national conversation about doing it right. And the good thing is that because we are one of the sunniest, windiest countries on earth, we have a price competitive advantage in things like processing using renewable energy to process metals, for example. So, you know, as we develop these new industries, we can have jobs at home. We can have jobs closer to regional centres in Australia. But yes, we need to be setting in place policy frameworks and core principles early to make sure that these new industries, they really do benefit regional Australia, that they really do benefit Indigenous communities, and that, sure, like these industries are crucially important for us at a global scale for tackling climate change, but it doesn't mean that you can destroy the environment in the locations for these really large renewable energy projects. So we're, you know, all mining, all large-scale projects going to have some environmental impacts, but the key thing is to mitigate those impacts as much as possible. So I hope that's a reasonable answer, right? If we haven't had that serious discussion, we need to be having those discussions now as a country.
Thanks, Wes. We probably only have time for one or two more questions. My next question is for Amanda. How can you see climate change action and adaptation intersecting more meaningfully with disaster resilience in this next chapter?
It's a really good question. In the past, I've been quite a strong advocate for us not working on adaptation, so how to cope with events, because I thought it was really critical that we were quite focused on mitigation, so reducing emissions primarily. I think my view has changed now that we are witnessing such big disasters and we're clearly unprepared. We also have a vehicle through the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action of deep expertise in emergency management and emergency preparedness. So I think it was 2 years ago now, the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action ran a summit during the Royal Commission process on how do we better prepare for these events, a series of a lot of recommendations. I can't remember how many. A lot of it got taken up by the Royal Commission. And since that time, we've been advocating for the Royal Commission's recommendations to be implemented fully. None of those recommendations have been implemented fully at a federal level. And our criticism of the flood response was that a lot of this could have been better prepared for just looking at the Royal Commission's recommendations. So through ELCA primarily, we will be doing work on pushing Labor to fully implement that, both at a federal level and then with state governments, them doing their work to implement it. We've had a good reception so far with the Minister for the issue, Murray Watt, and that will be the primary vehicle. I think it's important both because obviously people are suffering, but also to tell the story on the necessity of getting emissions down. We can now point to just how costly it is to fail to have prepared and to have got emissions down in the past. And we have a very clear story on the cost of failing to act. And I think that that's so tangible that it's important for us to bring that out too. So from the communications perspective, we've done a lot on that area. I'll share in the chat our recent tool that we released on insurance risk, which allows you to zoom in on suburb, LGA and electorate level data on the risk of the uninsurability risk.
I'm a bit biased, but I think that tool is absolutely incredible. So I'd encourage anyone to get onto our website and plug in your postcode and your address and see what comes up. So Nicki, I have a question for you now. This is a question from Richard, who says, Richard Dennis has called for a tax on gas companies. Does this offer any benefit in your opinion?
So I think taxing any one company, I haven't seen Richard's arguments on this particular one, so I'm not sure why he's suggesting that as to what our company's trying to get to. But if you're trying to penalise fossil fuel or greenhouse gas emitters, then the most economically sensible way to do this is to have a carbon price. The best way for us to transition is to have a carbon price. But of course, in this country, it's now politically almost impossible. I hope that we will change in the coming years, but it might not be soon enough. And that means, unfortunately, that we end up with a whole load of piecemeal policies that, and it's something that I'm sort of looking into at the moment, but if you look at the average cost of a reduced unit of carbon under many policies, things like solar, for example, often the cost can be as much as $200 a tonne. Now, that's clearly not what you'd pay even in the European Union, where permits are being taken out of the market and the price has gone up a lot. You're still not getting anywhere near that level of carbon price. Of course, the less we do and the longer we take to do it, the higher that price is going to go. But So, you know, I don't think taxing gases these companies is going to do anything at the moment. Probably, you know, we're going to do more of a carrot rather than the stick approach, and that means offering incentives to switch. We can put in some sticks through regulation. So, for example, banning gas connections in new developments, mandating, you know, 7-star buildings, that sort of thing. We've got, of course, the safeguards mechanism that is going to hopefully, you know, put more pressure on the big emitting companies in this country, and we can get, you know, people to hopefully you know, have incentives to switch over from you know, gas heating, for example, to reverse cycle electric, and same with your cookware, all of your appliances. So we're working more in an incentives, and the same goes for EVs. You know, we've got all range of state government things are on the table. The federal government's going to lower the tax as well, import taxes. But, you know, essentially that's not the best policy, and it will cost us more to do it this way than if we had a universal policy. But I'd rather take something than nothing. So let's go with all of the things that we've got and try and get as much progress as we can. But, you know, I would, if I were leading the country, I would definitely be not only banning fossil fuel new investments, but I'd also, and not just thinking about how we, you know, maybe put a super tax or a tax on the super profits of those companies. And I think that's possibly what Richard Dennis was talking about. And absolutely, these resources belong to all Australians. There's a cost associated with it, an externality, as we economists call it, and it should be given back to the people of Australia to help us cope with that. But we don't want to be encouraging gas in any way, shape or form, or relying on those revenues. We want to be moving to renewables.
Thanks, Nicki. I think I speak for everyone here when I say we all wish that you were leading the country.
Absolutely.
I have one last question, and this one's for Amanda. So what practical things can people do right now to push for urgent action on climate change?
Yep. I usually think about how to create change as every one of us having sort of 3 buckets. There's a treasure. So where do you put your money? And that can be your super, your bank investments. It can be your personal contributions to organisations like the Climate Council or other not-for-profits that are doing work. Then it's about your voice. I think it was really interesting yesterday. One of our staff was at the City for Melbourne did a consultation about bike paths, and she went in with a whole range of other people that were passionate about bike paths and was really pushing for the council policy to be considering it. And it was interesting seeing the councillors' response to that, which is really positive, saying, oh, you know, we've heard from the community, there's a lot of people that really care about bike paths. We shouldn't just think about advocacy as being the federal government's remit. This is state governments, it's local governments, it's businesses. Those federal government usually gets, you know, the lion's share of all the advocacy in Australia. It can actually be a smaller group of people that can have quite a big impact at other levels of government or in business. So our voices are important. Our voices in communicating through whether it's writing letters to the paper, to our politicians, to each other. That voice piece is really important. I think was seen collectively through the election. And then our time. I think that there's lots of ways in which we can have an influence in our own sphere. One thing that I do when I go and I think about the Climate Council as a catalyst for change, and I think we all have a bit of that capacity within us to be sharing what is working, to be sharing the urgency for action. And I'm finding that lots of people are finding ways in their sphere. So yesterday, talking to a group that is working with community housing. So how do we build houses better into the future? Talking to local governments, talking to teachers about how they think about using energy in the school, educating the next generation, veggie gardens, solar panels on roofs, thinking about your sphere of influence and how it can make a change using your time. I think that's really, really positive.
Thanks, Amanda. We're coming to the end of our session today, but I hope everyone can stick around with us just for a few more minutes because I really want to end on a high note. I just wanted to ask one more final question to all of our panellists, and I'd also love to hear from our audience today, so please add your thoughts in the chat. And that question is, just briefly, what are you most excited or hopeful about in this new era for climate action in Australia? So we'll start with Wes, then we'll go to Nicki, and we'll finish with Amanda.
I think I'm most excited about the way that climate action is being reframed as being, is tied with Australia's national interests are tied with climate action, right? The global transition to net zero emissions is now inevitable. Our national interests are not tied to being the last country to close the door on fossil fuels. They are tied to being a leader. You know, our economic opportunities are going to be there in the clean energy exports, but also our strategic opportunities. You know, our diplomacy, our foreign policy is tied with being with taking action on climate change. And we can see that already with this government in the language about wanting to see Australia become a renewable superpower, wanting to host the UN Climate Summit in the next couple of years. We do have a fair way to go. We've only just come now to where the rest of the world is. But I think as you know, the global shift continues to gather momentum, it's really clear that our national interests are tied to being a leader, not being last in the race.
Mm.
Nicki, how about you?
Look, absolutely echo Wes's sentiments. You know, as I said at the start, it feels like we're in just such a different environment where, you know, the thoughts of people like the organisations like the Climate Council are being embraced, not rejected or ridiculed. But, you know, I'm also optimistic that while we face an immense task, the ingenuity of mankind to do something about, you know, when we face problems. We saw this in COVID, you know, how quickly international, you know, sciences, health professionals got together and found, you know, solutions to, well, not curing it, obviously, but managing things better, coming up with a vaccine quickly. When mankind faces these, you know, incredible disasters, we have this amazing ingenuity, and Australia has such, you know, we have a wealth of resources, of skilled people, we have sun and wind, we have everything that we possibly need here to not only do the right thing by our citizens, but to lead the world. You know, the economics of this makes sense, and it's so great to be able to have a government that is listening to what is economically rational to do, as well as environment. It's not just a bunch of greenies, this actually makes sense. So to have that embraced, you know, I do feel optimistic. I get the sense that, you know, everyone's rowing in the same direction now. You know, younger people are, but not just younger people, us oldies too. You know, we do want change, and we've reached a tipping point. This election has shown us that. So, you know, on with the show.
They're really great responses, and I can jump in with something brief. And it just reminds me, yesterday when I was giving this presentation, a man asked me, or kind of made a comment, and he was like, oh, well, all of this is good and well that you've got these ideas for how you could change the country, but I'm a cynic, and things never change, and things are really hard to change, and blah, 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 blah. And I just thought, well, what I said was, you know, we've got two options here. We can either say, you know, I'm cynical, it's hard to change things, and you're right, maybe things won't change, but that's just giving up and just thinking, you know, that's how things are going to be. That's like, okay, let's stamp it that that's the way things are going to be forever. No, we've got this great opportunity. My daughter, who you met previously, keeps singing this song from the musical Hamilton, like, what a time to be alive right now is one of the lines. And what a privilege we have to live at this time when we can make a difference, and where our country is on this sort of journey where it's been hard, but we're now getting all this momentum. So I feel really excited about the momentum. I feel like we can make a really big difference. We won't get everything we want. It'll be hard. It'll be onerous. There'll be times of, you know, troughs. There'll be times of elation, but I feel really optimistic. There's this great quote. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's about hope being like an axe that you knock the door down. It's not a passive emotion. I think we need to be actively hoping for change, meaning we'll get there and we'll be knocking the door down, being like, right, we're going to change things in this country.
Wow, what an inspiring note to end on, and hopefully everyone who tuned in today is feeling as energized and inspired as I am after hearing from our brilliant speakers. So thank you so much to our panel for joining us today, and thanks to everyone who tuned in, and for those who submitted questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but remember, you can email us with questions at info@climatecouncil.org.au. And if you missed part of the session here today, don't worry, a recording will be emailed to you shortly, along with all of the resources posted in the comments section. So we really hope you enjoyed this discussion, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. So have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thanks for coming.